Good evening. I'm Kranti Saran and I teach philosophy at Ashoka University, a university dedicated to the liberal arts and funded by private and collective philanthropy. On behalf of Ashoka University, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the 8th seminar of our series Beyond the Classroom. At Ashoka University, we aim to make a difference by sharing our research and expertise with students and the general public. At a time when many are confined to their homes, we bring you a taste of what makes the Ashoka classroom an electrifying experience. Join us every Wednesday and Saturday evening at 8:30 p.m. on an intellectual adventure led by an Ashoka faculty member who will present a short and accessible glimpse of their work. After their presentation, you are welcome to ask the faculty member questions. Tonight, I'm delighted to introduce Professor Ali Khan Mahmudabad, an assistant professor of history and political science at Ashoka University. His interests have focused on matters of religious identity, democracy, culture, politics, and security in both South Asia and West Asia. He writes regularly for various publications in English and also writes a column called Sada-i-Dil for the Urdu daily Inqilab. He recently published his first book, Poetry of Belonging, Muslim Imaginings of India 1850 to 1950 with Oxford University Press. Good evening, Ali. How are you?
Good evening, Kranti. How are you? How are you doing in the lockdown?
Very well. Luckily, mangoes have started arriving, so there's not too much more that one could ask for. We're all really looking forward to your talk today. And I know everybody is really waiting to get into it. But before we do that, I just have a couple of quick housekeeping announcements to make. Ali will first speak for around 20 minutes, after which you can ask questions using the Q&A feature on Zoom. You can choose to share your name or to send your questions anonymously. All seminars are recorded and will be uploaded to our website so that you can watch it again or share it with your friends. We will send you a link for the entire series soon. Thank you once again. And without any further ado, let me turn over the screen to Ali.
Thank you, Kranti. So my name is Ali Khan, and I teach political science and history at Ashoka University. I teach courses on the history of nationalism, the history of revolution, on political Islam. I do a long course called Critical Concepts in Islam, where we go through 1400 years of Islamic history. And I also teach some courses on the Middle East. This particular topic is, for me, close to my heart because poetry often is seen simply as either a part of literature or as a form of entertainment, but is rarely taken seriously as a part of religious tradition. And so in this talk today, which I hope will be quite simple, I want to essentially show you how Muslims throughout the centuries, almost over a period of 1,000 years, have used poetry as a kind of way of engaging with everyday philosophy. You know, generally when someone says the word philosophy, you often hear it being accompanied by the word epistemological or ontological or metaphysical or dialectic, these terms that often we lose ourselves in. But poetry, in a sense, offers a kind of accessible form of philosophy where those old questions that have been asked for almost millennia now about what is the common good, what is it to be human, what is our purpose in life, what is a good life, what is a happy life, these are some of the questions that people have sought to answer. So without further ado, I'll begin my talk, and there should be some translations which appear on your screen from time to time. And you can, of course, ask me any questions you want at the end. So we'll begin in ancient Greece rather than ancient Arabia, in Plato's time, who in his book, the famous book, The Republic, in books 2 and 3, he writes that he would banish poets from his Republic. And the question is why? So one of the reasons is that poets were seen to be subversive. They were people who could easily cause the common person to go astray. If you want to draw an analogy to today's world, media, social media, film, all of these are censored by governments, and the amount to which they're censored, of course, tells us something about the government. But the reason that they're censored is because what is recognized is that these are media which, unless controlled, can really cause people all kinds of strife. So from ancient Greece, we have this glimpse of how poets were thought of in society. And if we come to ancient Arabia, in the period which is called the Jahiliyyah, the age of ignorance, or at least that's how Muslims call it, there was a huge amount of poetry, and poetry was really one of the distinct markers of the age. One of the most important aspects of Jahiliyyah, in other words, pre-Islamic poetry, were the Saba Mu'allaqat, the seven hanging verses. And there were a number of poets who became very famous. And the poetry that they wrote and the forms that it took talked about the beloved, camp ruins, the desert, the gazelle, tribal lineages, and so on. And poetry was really a very important, in a sense, currency, a cultural currency. And every year there was a fair in a place called Ukaz. Poets would be called, they would be respected and honored for their composition. So much so that in pre-Islamic Arabia, and this tradition continued until after the revelation and the life of Muhammad, the Prophet, there was a distinct genre called Majaz, which is battle poetry. So can you imagine, there was a time when instead of fighting it out, poets would be battling each other and abusing each other on a battlefield, hoping that just the insults would be bloody enough for the other side to withdraw. Now, before we go any further, I have a little poll which I'd like you to do. There's going to be a question and 3 answers. And I hope you can take 35, 45 seconds to pick one of the answers. And the question will soon pop up on your screen, which is, where did the ghazal originate from? Where do you think the ghazal, which many of you might have heard of, where does it originate from? We'll have another 20 seconds or so. So there's a little red thing which says host and panelists can't vote. It wouldn't make sense if I voted. So I hope you've all made a choice, and we can see the answers on the screen in a few seconds. So that's interesting. I thought that means a lot of you do know that, or perhaps the hint was enough that it originated in pre-Islamic Arabia. In fact, the ghazal is a form of poetry which is highly technical and highly regimented in terms of its meter and its and the form and structure it takes on. And it's one of these things that has traveled from pre-Islamic Arabia, from the Arabian Peninsula across the world to Turkey, to Central Asia, to Iran, and to South Asia. Now, coming back to Arabia, it is in this context that the Quran is revealed. And interestingly, just like Plato's observation or his hope that poets would find no place in his republic, the Quran, in a chapter called Ash-Shu'araa, also warns people against the power of poets in leading them astray, and in poets being potential hypocrites, in other words, not practicing what they preach. In another verse of the Quran, it also says that poets, the Quran is not poetry. So this is something important to remember. Although the Quran is mellifluous to recite, you can recite the Quran, it has internal rhyme schemes, but there is no poetry. It is not poetry. And one of the allegations against Muhammad, the Prophet, was that he was a poet. And that the second verse of the Quran, which I alluded to, was a rebuttal of that. Now, one of the important things to think about is that the Quran, for most Muslims, is the word of God. And it forms one of the 2 main pillars from which everyone draws Muslims draw their tradition and their belief. The other being the Sunnah, which is the normative example of the Prophet. In other words, the Prophet's life serves as an ideal template. And of course, there's not much time to go into his life, but one of the things that I want to focus on as part of this talk is an incident which is the Laylatul Miraj, which is the night of ascension. And the night of ascension was a night in which the Prophet is meant to have traveled on a winged horse to the outer limits of what the human mind can comprehend. In Arabic, it's called Sidratul Muntaha. It is marked by a gigantic tree, the lot tree. And in a sense, if you want to think about it, the lot tree marks the limit of reason, right? The limits of how we can comprehend the material world, the limits of our own minds. Because of course, one of the conceits of human beings is that we are capable of understanding everything, and we do not therefore understand the basic limitations of our own minds. So the Prophet goes on this Mi'raj, on this ascension, and you can see a beautiful miniature painting depicting this, and he comes back. And he brings with him a gift, according to how the Sufis interpret this episode in the Prophet's life. And that gift was a gift of spiritual power. And what Muhammad does is he says, he asks his companions and his family members, I will give this gift to whoever is most deserving of it, depending on your answer. So one person says, I would take this power of this gift and remove all poverty. Someone else says that I will take this gift and I will stop all bloodshed and war, and so on and so forth. And then Ali's term came, and Ali was Muhammad's son-in-law and his cousin. And he gives a very interesting answer. He says, I will use this gift to put a veil on other people's shortcomings. Now, this is not an answer that even perhaps you or I would give as a matter of course. To hide other people's faults, that's what he would use this gift for. And this is why Ali, in Sufi silsilas and tariqas, in other words, Sufi genealogies, is the source from which they draw their legitimacy. Apart from the Naqshbandis, who have a different genealogy, nearly every Sufi brotherhood, fraternity in the world draws their legitimacy from Ali. Now, Ali, Muhammad, these are seen as the perfect, the archetypal men, the ideal men from whom one can learn how to raise one's own consciousness. And one of the things which we think about when thinking about what is the common good, what is it to be human, how do we know what it is to act practically in a good manner. For Muslims, often it is the example of the Prophet and the example of Ali that is looked to. Now here, let me take you to this small incident which happened in 627 during the Battle of Khandak. Khandak means trench in Arabic, where one of the most mighty warriors of the Quraysh, one of the opponents of Muhammad and Ali, Amr ibn Abi Wid, met Ali on the battlefield, and he was a legendary fighter. And Ali went out to meet him, and he laughed at Ali and said, this is a young boy, you know, I can smite him with one blow. But as it happens, Ali, who was also very famous, La fata illa Ali, la sayfa illa Zulfiqar. There is no young man like Ali. There is no sword like the Zulfiqar, the sword of 2 points that Ali carried, the stuff of legends. He knocked Amr ibn Abi Wid down and was about to kill him when Amr ibn Abi Wid spat on his face. او خدو انداخت بر روی علی افتقار هر نبی و هر ولی. And he spat on Ali's face. And Ali, he who is the pride of every prophet and of every saint. And what Ali does at this moment is where combat with the self begins. Ali withdraws. He does not kill Amr ibn Abi Wid. And the reason that he does not kill Amr ibn Abi Wid is because he realizes that in that moment of anger, his intention might be for seeking revenge and not for truly fighting in the way of God. So you see here that jihad bin nafs, combat with the self, there is actually a sort of example from history which becomes a part of the folklore of Muslims. And the poem that I quoted from, the translation of which is on your screen, was written by Maulana Rumi, who we'll speak about in more detail later on. So he says, as Ali amuz ikhlas amal, learn purity of intent from Ali. So even when he was in the battlefield, the true example that he leaves for the rest of people, all of us who might have got upset and sort of struck the person back, is to withdraw. So jihad bin nafs, combat with the self, is essentially the desire to fight against the base self, envy, greed, hate, anger, lust, all of these base aspects of ourselves. And this is really essentially what mysticism and the poets that write about mysticism try and capture. This struggle that we all undertake every day to fight our own senses, to overcome our base desires, our base motives, in order to be a better human being. So one of the things that emerges from this episode is that poets like Maulana Rumi, who is often associated and thought of as a universalist, as a humanist, were very much rooted in the Islamic tradition. And you know, if you read the Masnavi, which has been translated into dozens and dozens of languages, that rootedness in the Quran, in the hadith sayings of the Prophet, in episodes of Islamic history, those become, of course, lost in translation. In fact, the Italian saying, il traduttore tratiore, the translator is a traitor, is very much true for poetry in particular, because in translation, everything is lost. Now, one of the things that happens in the period following the Prophet's life, in which there were a number of famous poets, Hassan ibn Sabit, Ka'b ibn Zuhair. Ka'b ibn Zuhair was given a mantle, a cloak by the Prophet because he composed such beautiful poetry. And so from that period of the 7th century all the way till the 10th century is the period in which essentially orthodoxy crystallized. And therefore it was a period of great ferment in the Muslim world. There were huge debates about theology, about law, about jurisprudence, and of course about mysticism. So some of the earliest mystics we have, the first woman mystic that we know of, Rabia al-Basri, the other famous mystic of that period, Mansur al-Hallaj, who is killed. Mansur is killed for saying, Ana al-Haq, I am the truth. The orthodox, the literalists, orthodox Muslims thought that Mansur was committing blasphemy because he was saying, Ana al-Haq, I am the truth. But of course, Mansur had reached a level of spiritual wayfaring in which Mansur had ceased to be. It was God speaking ostensibly through Mansur. And so this question, which really lies at the heart of all the philosophical problems that we encounter, of who is the other, becomes one of the most important themes also for mysticism. Who is the kafir? You know, as many of you know, kafir is one of the most misunderstood words across the world. And even by Muslims themselves, kafara in Arabic means to conceal or cover with a cloth. So Fakhruddin Iraqi, a 13th century poet, perhaps with Mansur al-Hallaj in mind, or perhaps with other people who have been slain for their beliefs, slain for being who they are, for saying what they believe, he says, dar kudam mazhab astin, ba kudam millat astin, ki kushand ashiqi ra, ki tu ashiqam charai. What religion permits this? What community permits this? That they kill the lover saying, why do you love me? So the idea of the other, who is the other? Now the mystic or the poet will often say that actually the Muslim himself or herself contains within themselves the other, that base self that they have. And so the famous poet Saadi says, Agar kafir na shudi lazzat-e iman che shanasi. If you have not been a kafir, if you have not disbelieved, then how can you possibly know of the joy of believing, of faith? And Yagana Changezi, skipping from the 13th to the 20th century, he says, Sab tere siva kafir, akhir iska matlab kya? Sar phira de insan ka, aisa khabte mazhab kya? So what, everyone except you is a kafir. What can this mean? What kind of obsession with religion is this that makes men go mad? The point, of course, here is not that people, these are humanists or people who are trying to create a tradition outside Islam, but in a sense, at the time of the crystallization of orthodoxy, they are basically asking fundamental questions about what Islam seeks to promote, what are the values, and therefore how to see the other. You know, in a sense, even today in the modern world, we haven't overcome this problem. The kafir of the nation state is the traitor. We still have this idea of the other. We can't seem to run away from the idea of defining our sense of self in opposition to someone else. And that's why one of the most important themes which you find across mystical poetry is that of avoiding hypocrisy. And it is hypocrisy that becomes really one of the chief concerns, and highlighting hypocrisy that becomes the chief concern of poets across the millennia, across the centuries. Indeed, in the Quran, the munafiqeen, as they're called in Arabic, the hypocrites, for them is reserved the lowest levels of hell. And in fact, God goes so far as to say that if you do an injustice towards me, in other words, towards God, that I can forgive you. But because hypocrisy means deceiving other human beings, means, in a sense, breaking their trust, taking advantage of their trust, that is a sin that is unforgivable. So at a time when orthodoxy and tradition are crystallizing and people are becoming more and more focused on the superficial, on the apparent, on the literal, these mystics, these poets pose a kind of conundrum. And that is why you see wine as one of the chief symbols which is employed in order to tell people to guard against being arrogant about being a practicing Muslim, practicing in the literal sense, right? Because most of the mystics, what they try and preach is the combination of Shariat and Tariqat. Shariat means Islamic law, Tariqat means the path of spiritual wayfaring. And in fact, if you look at the Arabic roots of the word Shariat, it is not like a code of law, but in fact, it connotes the moving stream of water which takes you to a point of origin, to a goal. So the Shariat is not a goal in itself. It is merely a means towards that goal. So coming back to this metaphor of wine, Omar ibn Al-Faridh, a great poet, he says, Sharibna ala dhikri habibi mudamatan. Remember, he's writing in the 12th century. Sharibna ala dhikri habibi mudamatan. Sakirna biha min qablu an yakhlakul karm. In the name of the beloved, I have been drinking for an eternity, and I was intoxicated even before the creation of the grapevine. Now, Umar ibn al-Farid was a very orthodox and practicing Muslim, much like in the 20th century, Riaz Khairabadi, who is perhaps one of the Urdu language's greatest exponents of writing wine songs, of what is called khimriyat. And Riaz Khairabadi's work is also replete with metaphor of wine as something that contains within it divine love. It is a way to reaching towards love. So sharibna ala dhikri habibi mudamatan. This wine is the heavenly nectar, and in a sense, it is of course used as a metaphor. And over the period of Islamic history, there have been a number of poets who have drank also and have announced that they drink. Ghalib being one, Majaz Lucknawi being another. Both of these we will encounter in a little while. Abu Nawas from the Abbasid period being another. The point, of course, is this, that these were people who emerged from within Islamic tradition, but did not want to hide this aspect of themselves. They did not want to be hypocrites. And so this metaphor carries further, and one of the other symbols, one of the other tropes that a lot of poets use is the idea and symbol of the wine, of the tavern, of the innkeeper, of the zahid and the ascetic, as opposed to the person who goes to the inn to drink. So, for example, Fakhruddin Iraqi, the poet who I mentioned earlier, he says, "Baqamar khana raftam hama pak baz didam, chub suma rasidam hama yaftam riai. بالتواف کعبه رفتم به رحم ندادن که برون در چه کردی که درون خانه آیی در دیر می زدم من که یکی ز در آمد که درا عراقی که تو خاصگان مایی." I went to circumambulate the Kaaba and I was not allowed in, and a voice called out to me and said, "Why do you want to enter after what you have done outside my walls?" And then I went to the gambling house and all I saw were pure souls. And then I went to the religious ceremony, the Sama ceremony of the Sufis, and all I saw were abstaining hypocrites. And so I knocked on the door of the monastery and a person came out and said, come in, Iraqi, for you are one of my special ones. So Iraqi expresses this through this ghazal. Sheikh Bahauddin Amali, another great exponent from a few centuries later, from from Fakhruddin Iraqi. He says, Har dar ke zanam sahib on khana tui tu. Har rah ke rabam partab kashana tui tu. Dar meikade o deir ke janana tui tu. Maqsood man as Kaaba o budkhana tui tu. Maqsood tui Kaaba o budkhana bahana. That every door I knocked on, you answered my call. And you, of course, are the measure of all things. And you are in the tavern, and you are also in the monastery. And my goal was you when I was searching for the Kaaba and the temple. For truly, the Kaaba and the temple were mere excuses. And these are themes, these are tropes that occur again and again in various languages, in Persian and Arabic, in Turkish, in Urdu, which seek to highlight, in a sense, the hypocrisy that often leads or is a result of the arrogance that people have from believing that they are performing the rituals, and that in itself is enough. So then how do we make sense of this poetry? Where is it taking us to? What is the goal of this poetry? In a sense, Maulana Rum's Masnavi, the highly beautiful verse that the Masnavi begins with, it's very short, and it says, Bishnu az nay chun hikayat mi kunad, as judaiha shikayat mi kunad. Listen to the reed and its haunting tale of separation, as it cries and it bewails its fate. Now the reed, as you know, is used to make a flute, the reed pipe, and it produces the most beautiful sound, and it is a sound that exists within classical music in South Asia, in Iran, and Central Asia. And the reed, which is cut off from its roots in the river, laments in the same way as the human soul laments about being cut off from the divine. So in a sense, what people are searching for and what these mystics are trying to convey to us is the fact that we raise ourselves, we raise our own sense of our consciousness in order to reach a point where our own ego and our base desires are completely suppressed, and when we merge into the divine. As Ghalib says, Ishrat-e qatra hai darya mein fana ho jana, dard ka had se guzarna hai dawa ho jana. It is the desire of every drop of water to be enveloped by the river, to be enveloped by the ocean. For pain to exceed itself is a cure unto itself. So this point, this idea of this spiritual wayfaring, this journey, this is again, the journey is one of the most important themes. And again, one of the things that we have to think about and imagine is that in our material world, where we do think, we have the arrogance to think that our human minds, which have their own, of course, limits, that these can comprehend through the material world and arrive at answers, arrive at divinity. One of the things that these poets do is to break the kind of arrogance that emerges and as a result of humans thinking that they are the center of the universe. In a sense, apart from telling us about to be beware of the base desires of man, to be beware of hypocrisy, the values of humility, of poverty, of generosity, all values that the Prophet embodied and you find within the poetry, these are values that are sought to be promoted. And so there is no point of arrival. And this is one of the most in terms of philosophy, this is one of the most important themes that again recurs across the centuries. Hafiz, the Iranian poet, he writes, Hafiz shikayat az ghame hijran che mikoni, dar hijr vasl bashad dar zulmat ast nur. Oh Hafiz, why do you complain of the sadness of separation? For in departing you are arriving, and in darkness there is light. So you see here, one of the interesting aspects of all this poetry is that the poetry does not preach to you. The poetry, in a sense, carries within it a message for which the key lies in your own heart, in your own soul, in your own condition and your understanding of yourself. And therefore, there is no preaching which takes place through poetry. Similar to Hafiz, Bedil Dehlavi, another Persian poet, tremendously important in the annals of literature. He says, "Giriftar do alam rangam az birahmiye nazat, asir ulfate khud kun, agar mikhahi azadi." That trapped between these two worlds, this world and the world after death, I am colored or covered by your cruelty, by the fact that you do not. I am unable to see you. I am unable to behold you. But the key to this problem is that I need to become a prisoner of my own happiness if I truly want to know freedom. So you see, there is a contradiction in the Hafiz Sher earlier, in this couplet just now of Mirza Abdul Qadir Bedil. There is a contradiction that you have to be a prisoner in order to be free. And again, this is one of the key aspects that we find across the poetry, in all the poets that we think about, apart from warning us against our base self, against hypocrisy, they're also saying, be careful of thinking you have arrived. Be careful of thinking you have found, because finding means that there is no need to change anymore. And of course, the fact is that we are all imperfect beings. So Majaz Lucknavi perhaps says this most beautifully. He says, खुद दिल में रह के आंख से पर्दा करे कोई, हाँ लुत्फ ये कि पाके भी ढूंढा करे कोई. You who are veiled in my heart, you who live in my heart are veiled from my eyes. And truly the pleasure lies in continuing to seek having found you. रंगीनिये नकाब में गुम हो गई निगाह, क्या बेहिजाबियों का तकाजा करे कोई. And so I am lost in the bewildering colors of your divinity as it is manifested in nature. So how can I even dare to ask you, O God, to become unadorned, for me to dare to see you? And so this is really one of the goals, I suppose, of this mystical poetry, that apart from this combat against the self, combat against lust and anger and greed and envy, in order to be fully human, in order to raise our consciousness, in order to raise up our sense of self, what Iqbal says, uses the word khudi for, khudi ko kar baland itna, khudi ko kar baland itna कि हर तकदीर से पहले खुदा बंदे से खुद पूछे बता तेरी रजा क्या है. Elevate your conscious to such a high extent that before everything that happens, God asks you, tell me what you want. And in that sense, this is the true goal of this spiritual and mystical wayfaring. And one of the most important things, I think, to end with, which I'd like to talk about, is that as one walks this mystical path, as one thinks about how to combat our base sense of self, our base desires, how to elevate our human consciousness, how not to get trapped with the idea that we have arrived somewhere, that we have found something authentic. Because of course, authenticity means that your mind has been able to comprehend divinity. And divinity is, of course, it is beyond the lottery, it is beyond our comprehension. This aspect of raising ourselves is perhaps truly embodied by the fact that we are able to not cause pain unto ourselves, nor cause pain to others. So the idea of suffering and sorrow, and this is the last thing that I wanted to talk about, also become very important parts of this journey. We often think about sorrow and grief as things that are negative, that things that we need to move away from. But in fact, to be able to share someone's grief, to be able to share someone's sorrow, to be able to sense someone's suffering, that is truly what makes us human. किसी का दर्द देखूं हो नहीं सकता मेरे दिल से, नजर सयाद की झपके तो कह दूं कुछ अनादिल से. I am unable to bear the pain of others. किसी का दर्द देखूं हो नहीं सकता मेरे दिल से. My heart cannot bear seeing the pain of others. And if for 1 minute the sayyad looks the other way, the hunter looks the other way, I will tell the birds that they should fly away. So in fact, causing someone else hurt or causing yourself hurt That is perhaps the biggest sin. And that hurt perhaps is caused most deeply by hypocrisy, by a hypocritical attitude towards ourselves and towards the world. And in order to be able to sense this hypocrisy within ourselves and perhaps sense it within others, but that is something that is best left unto others, for we have to, it takes a whole lifetime to just make ourselves become worthy of elevation. Sorrow and grief, in a sense, make our heart open. They prepare the ground, as it were, for us to walk this mystical path. Dil lazzate gham ki nemat par beja nahi jitna naaz kare, mil jaye to ay hasne wale tu mujhse zyada naaz kare. Dil lazzate gham ki nemat par. There is no limit to how much the heart can be proud of the ecstasy of sorrow. And you who laugh at me for this, if only you could get a taste, then you too would smile. So thank you very much for listening. And I'm sure perhaps there are many questions. So I'd like to now invite Manani Menon to moderate the questions. Manani is an undergraduate student at the University of Oxford. She is reading for law at University College, Oxford, and she was an undergrad at Ashoka University. And I was very fortunate to have had her in many of my classes, one of my best students. Lovely to see you again, Manani.
Hi, Professor. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. I don't think I'm alone in saying that it definitely made me think about a lot of things that I haven't before. And it really took me back to being in your classroom at Ashoka. So that was really nice.
Thank you.
So we have a lot of questions. So I'm going to jump right into it. I've tried to sort of group them into similar themes so we can sort of take as many questions as possible. So I think the first question that a lot of people had was, to what extent would you say the tradition of Islamic poetry is still relevant today?
So I think that's a fantastic question. And in fact, I think that not only the tradition of Islamic poetry is still relevant, and Islamic, I mean in the broadest sense. I don't think anyone needs to be Muslim in order to appreciate this poetry. But of course, one has to be familiar with the language, whether it's Persian, whether it's Arabic, whether it's Urdu. And if you see in the popular space, you have at this time in India, for instance, you have an effervescence, a kind of resurgence of interest in Urdu, in the ghazal, and mushairas, which are these poetic symposiums, where the space where poetry is recited. These are being held in Delhi, in Dallas, in Dubai, all across the world. And one of the very interesting things about the mushaira as a space is, and a South Asian space particularly, is that it has always brought people from different communities together. It is a space of poetry that is, because it does not deal with the ritualistic aspect of religion, but in a sense deals with the higher purpose of what religion tries to point us towards. I think it's tremendously important, and you see it everywhere. I mean, poetry, Jaan hai to jahan hai, our Prime Minister said. It's actually taken from Mir Taqi Mir's poem. Mir Taqi Mir was another great poet who wrote about how difficult this path of spiritual wayfaring is. So I think it's tremendously relevant today.
All right. So I remember, Professor, we in a lot of the classes that I took with you, we had these conversations a lot about sort of the importance of translation and the impact of translation on reading texts. And so Sahaj asked the question where he kind of wants to know how to best select what kind of translation to read and how to perhaps get the best, what kind of translation best captures the spirit of the poem that it's trying to sort of
Well, I mean, this is the holy grail. I think there is no answer to this apart from learning the language. But translations can approximate the original. As I said, the Rumi poem that I used from the Masnavi, for example, in that poem about Ali and being spat upon by that warrior, later on in that poem, he says, "Oh, you who are the door to the city of knowledge." Now, for someone who doesn't know, this is an allusion to a hadith of the Prophet, "Ana Madinatul Ilm wa Aliyun Babuha." I am the city of knowledge, and Ali is its gate. So unless, of course, there's a footnote or the translator is being honest enough, is not, in a sense, trying to also deliberately erase Islam from this poetry. This is a whole different topic, which, of course, we can talk about, is that there has been a deliberate erasure of Islam from Rumi's poetry, from Ghalib's poetry, from Mir's poetry, from Iqbal's poetry. So, you know, I'm sorry, this is not very helpful, but I think perhaps the more thorough the translation, the more notes they give you, the more footnotes perhaps that they are, it doesn't make it the process of learning or reading a poem becomes less enjoyable if you have to deconstruct it so much. And of course, this is the beauty of the poem, right? It resonates immediately with you. You don't, right. You know, it is something that does not need processing. And that is the true magic of poetry, in whichever language it may be, Hindi, Malayalam, Gujarati, English, Urdu, Arabic, is that immediately, and every person has their own understanding.
Yeah, so you also mentioned vernacular languages. Umar asked the question about what the experience is of reading poetry like this in the vernacular, say like Tamil or Bangla or so.
So I think you see, again, if you take the dohas of Kabir, for instance, you see a continuity in terms of the themes which a lot of the other mystics deal about. Now, this is not necessarily because, you know, Kabir read Omar ibn Al-Faridh, of course, or Fakhruddin Iraqi, but I think what it represents is the kind of the manner in which they were approaching the human condition. Of course, what belied that was the universality of the human condition. So, you know, I speak Urdu, I can understand Awadhi and Arabic and Persian, unfortunately, and Hindi, but I don't, speak the other languages. But, you know, for example, you know, there's in the 19th century, we have records of the Inamul Haq, who writes about literature in Bengal. He writes about Brahmins wandering as mendicants, reciting the Masnavi of Maulana Rum, right? This is not, you know, fiction. This is as kind of historical record. For example, in Phulwari Sharif in Bihar, Shah Sulaiman, who was the Pir there, he set the tune for the Masnavi to the Chaupai of the Ramayana. So because the aesthetic aspect was there, you know, the music of the Iranians might not necessarily resonate well with the ear of the Indian. And so, of course, all these things go through a process of change and so on. And these take centuries, these take time.
So when I took critical concepts in Islam with you, one of my areas of interest was definitely to do with sort of the aesthetics of not only of the Quran and poetry, but also just, you know, I remember studying architecture and things like that as well. So to me, this is quite an interesting question, because Shelley asks, to what extent is being religious or the religious experience important to reading poetry?
So I don't think it's being, I mean, look, we understand being religious as being dogmatically religious. So I don't think, in a sense, that is important. But what is important, I think, is that we have that capacity to feel, right? In Arabic, the word shir, which is also the word we use in Urdu, shir, it means to feel. And mash'ar is literally a site of religious pilgrimage. Mash'ar is also because you feel something there. So in a sense, the only condition is that your heart and your mind are open to sense, to feeling. And I think that is partly what explains someone like Rumi's success across the world. Notwithstanding the fact that I do think that to truly understand Rumi, you need to understand him as an orthodox Muslim who used Islamic metaphors and themes. But despite that, because his message is one that resonates with all of us, you know, these are the questions that we ask in our daily lives. How, you know, what is it to hurt someone else? What is it to be a hypocrite? How do we understand sorrow? How do we understand happiness? So I think the basic thing is to be able to feel. And I think, of course, that all humans are capable of doing.
Yeah. All right. So we had a question from an anonymous viewer who asked about the role of female poets in the writing of this tradition. So could you talk a little bit about that?
So Rabia al-Basri, as I said, there's still a lot of debate about biographical details about her life. But she was one of the earliest women mystics, and her poetry is very beautiful. I mean, you can find some of it perhaps on the internet and so on. Then throughout the ages, you have Rabia al-Adawiya al-Basri. Then throughout the period, of course, you have to remember that in terms of the archive, we don't really have access often to the poetry that I'm sure women were writing. Publicly, women start participating in a place like South Asia and sharing their poetry really at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century.
Right.
And even then, you know, and you have these very interesting accounts of mushairas or these poetic symposiums where the parda, or the, you know, a separation of men and women, there's a kind of space made for women in these physical spaces for the first time, and women come, then perhaps they recite their own poetry or others recite their poetry. Interestingly, when the telegraph first comes, women are some of the people who write and use the telegraph in order to ask for poets to correct their work. So technology, in a sense, helped bring out this poetry. But I suppose one of the things, you know, it reminds me of this joke that happened. There was a mushaira in Shimla that was happening, and someone, you know, the theme of ghazal poetry is the beloved. And of course, the beloved takes many forms. It could be a young man, it could be a young woman. And the separation from the beloved is what the theme is. And someone just started reciting a poem, their ghazal, and they didn't realize that women were present. And someone called out from the audience and said, "Look, now you have to watch what you're saying. They're here." So in terms of, you know, over the long course of 1,000 years, there have been women poets, both in Farsi and in Arabic. Obviously, not a dominant. There's no sort of proper representation as we might have today, but that changes really about 150 years ago.
Okay. All right. So I also saw a lot of questions about the relationship between poetry and religious orthodoxy. So I think that's quite an interesting topic. So I think it might be nice to talk about. So Fatima asks whether the different places in which poetry was being written, whether those local cultures encouraged a diversion from the tenets of Islam, and to what extent this might have happened.
So look, I mean, the idea we have of Islam today as an organized religion really emerges in the last 150, 200 years. So we have to really imagine a world, a pre-modern world, in which Islam as a category is much more capacious. It is much more broad and wide and all-encompassing. We have kind of cast Islam in the mold of Christianity as it develops in Europe, you know, in terms of organized religion. Right from the very inception, actually, if you look at the Abbasid period, if you look at the Umayyad period, the Abbasid period, these are the first two dynasties of Islam, or even subsequently, nearly everywhere people are judged. So I'm talking about the Sharia now. They're not only judged according to Islamic law, but also to tribal or customary law, right? And this is something that exists all the way up till the pre-modern period. And then, of course, with the rise of colonialism and ideas of nationalism, all of that changes things fundamentally. So we must, in a sense, we really need to move away from this static idea. This is not to say that there has not also been a group right since the inception of Islam that has focused on a literalist interpretation of the Quran, on a kind of focus on ritual practice, on trying to reduce religion to ritual practice. And of course, all of these poets were writing precisely in reply to these people. And you know, often whether it's Arabia, whether it's Iran, whether it's South Asia, the themes that are used by poets often do reflect their cultural surroundings. So a lot of poetry that is written in North India, you can see the influence of aspects of Hindu tradition, of the Bhakti tradition. In Iran, you can see aspects of Zoroastrianism. there is no clear rupture in our history. I think one of the most beautiful things about human history is that when we are not being destructive, is that we are able to weave things into each other, and that really is the genius of the human spirit, in a sense.
Yeah. So Supriya asks along the same vein whether you think poets had sort of a moderating effect on religious orthodoxy.
So again, it depends on they were themselves very orthodox, and this is something that as you probably remember from your class, we often make the mistake of seeing the poetry of Rumi or Iraqi or Hafiz or Ghalib as some kind of proto-secular poetry, right? Or some kind of poetry that is humanist, but actually it represents a current within religion, right? It emerges also from within Islam. To use a kind of slightly technical term, a kind of inner dialectic, right? It emerges from the various tugging and pulling of tradition that exists within religious tradition. And so, Rumi was orthodox. Orthodoxy is not the problem, really. What is the problem is thinking that the Sharia and ritual practice is an end unto itself, right? What the mystics will say is these are practices that discipline the body and the mind, but they only are paths to higher truths. They are not an end unto themselves. Of course, unfortunately, in the modern period, what we do is we tend to try and completely sort of decouple religion from the tradition, from the poetry, from the kind of religious tradition from which it emerges. So I think it's more complicated than kind of religious orthodoxy and poets who are rising above it, as it were.
Yeah. So we have a lot of questions about the Sufi tradition, so I thought I'd ask a few of those. So Samrid asks if you could talk a little bit about the whirling dervishes and the mysticism that's associated with their practice.
So of course, I mean, the Sufi practice is hugely heterogeneous. Within Sufism, you actually have people saying this is not correct practice. So that's really a part of the human condition. I think that we tend to critique and criticize anything that we're not comfortable with. So the whirling dervishes, who have one palm, in a sense, extended towards the heavens and another root pointed towards the earth, in a way they are kind of symbolically manifesting the link of the divine to the earth, and the turning they're turning that spiritual dance, the ecstasy. Not only does it lead into a kind of trance, but it also represents the whirling of the cosmos. मत सहल हमें जानो फिरता है फलक बरसों फिर खाक के पर्दे से इंसान निकलते हैं. Don't think, this is Mir Taqi Mir. He says, मत सहल हमें जानो फिरता है फलक बरसों. Don't think that this is easy. The cosmos revolves for centuries, and then from the curtain of dust, the veil of dust, does man eventually emerge. So, this whole, not only is that, of course, broadly about human beings and how difficult this path is of the mystical path, but also how essentially you spend your entire life journeying. And the dervishes, in a sense, represents the world turning on its axis. In Sufism, one of the things that traditional Sufis believe is that their guide, their pir, is a qutb, is a pole in Arabic. And so they often will whirl around that pole because the pir represents their link, their guide represents their link to the divine. So there are various kinds of revolution, literally, that are taking place in that space.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we also have quite a few questions about sort of the practical relevance and the importance of studying poetry in, so many thousand years after it was written. So Shweta asks whether a historian can sort of get any practical information such as that about, the economy or things like that of that time from reading poetry.
It's a really good question, and I think you can. So poetry is a historical archive. I think that's a very important topic, perhaps very understudied. Rajiv Kinra has this book on the life of a Mughal Munshi called Chandrabhan, who writes Persian poetry. So from Chandrabhan's poetry, you can glean a lot of things about how a Hindu who was working in the Mughal court saw himself, saw his use of Persian poetry, how he saw Iran, how he saw the Persian language. So there's definitely, you can glean a lot from poetry. And apart from that, more broadly speaking, for example, in the 19th century, you have a genre of poetry called She'ar Shob, which means lament of the city. And this is a kind of genre which is it is originally from Persian. Interestingly, in Persian, She'ar Shob is a form of ghazal poetry that writes about the beloved, often as a young boy, right? Mm-hmm. But in South Asia, that the She'ar Shob becomes literally a lament of the city. So following the invasions of Nadir Shah and Ahmad Shah Abdali in the 18th century, a lot of poets wrote these She'ar Shobs where they basically mourned the loss of their cities and documented to some extent the life of the city. Of course, there are problems of how elite this archive is, how much you can really interpret from it and so on. But nonetheless, there's huge scope for using it as a historical source.
Yeah, and I suppose that's so much of what your work is about as well.
That is indeed what my work is about, yes.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we only have time for one more question. So Shalini asks if you could perhaps share a few lines of your favorite poetry or poem.
My favorite poetry. Well, as I said, someone asked me this question the other day, and I must admit that my favorite really changes day to day depending on what I'm feeling. So, I don't, in that sense, I have no favorite. I have favorite poets. Right now, I suppose what would come to my mind is perhaps some more poetry of Majaz, whose poetry I ended the talk with. And he's really an amazing poet. He dies very young. He was an alcoholic. He died tragically on the roof of a liquor store. Mm-hmm. I think his friends locked him there and he died of hypothermia. But perhaps for me, the most brilliant poets of South Asia in the 20th century, and a tremendously sensitive man. And that really comes through in his poetry. Similar to, I also like Sahil Ludhianvi. I've been reading, because it's of course political, and we're at the moment living in very volatile times. But Majaz's poem, for instance, this one is in following with some of the themes that we spoke about, is Rudade ghame ulfat unse, hum kya kehte kyun kar kehte, ek harf na nikla hoton se, aur aankh mein aansu aa hi gaye, आशुफ्तगी वहशत की कसम, हैरत की कसम, हसरत की कसम, अब आप कहें या कुछ न कहें, हम राज़े तबस्सुम पा ही गए, इस महफिल कैफो मस्ती में, इस अंजुमने इरफानी में, सब जाम बकफ बैठे ही रहे, हम पी भी गए, छलका भी गए. So the last couplet, it says, in this gathering of full of divine light, in this mehfil of gnosis, of spiritually uplifted people, I have already drunk my wine, and so much so that it has spilled over. And earlier in the poem, he says, "Ashuftagi vahshat ki qasam, hayrat ki qasam, hasrat ki qasam." So I swear by the turbulence of wahshat, of being troubled, of hayrat, of being bedazzled, of hasrat, of desire. Ab aap kahen ya kuch na kahen, hum raaz tabassum pa hi gaye. Now, whether you reply to me or not, so obviously you're talking about the beloved, even if you reply to me or not, I have found the secret of your smile. So, this is some of the poetry that, there's one more couplet from this ghazal, perhaps the last thing I'll recite. It says, ye apni wafa ka alam hai, ab unki mohabbat kya kahiye. This is the state of my loyalty, and what can you say of their benevolence? In other words, of God, of the beloved. And of course, you have to remember that shikwa, the complaint to God, is a very important genre, which we didn't have time to cover as well, in which God is treated as someone who's so intimate that you can complain against them and to voice a complaint. So ये अपनी वफा का आलम है, अब उनकी मोहब्बत क्या कहिए, एक नश्तर ज़हरागी रखकर नज़दीक रगेजां भूल गए. That you know, in the Quran, it is believed that God is closer to you than your jugular vein. So the poet, he says that you have told me that you are closer to me than my jugular vein. You have put a poisoned lancet, a poisoned needle, and then you've proceeded to forget all about me.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, this Majaz Lucknawi, in a sense, is really, for those who haven't read him, perhaps they would enjoy reading him.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you, Madam.
No, I think we're out of time. Thank you so much, Professor. That was really wonderful.
Thank you, Manani. No, thank you. Lovely that you were able to do this and to see you and talk to you. And thank you all for watching. And see you again soon. And happy wayfaring.
All right. So on behalf of Ashoka University, thank you so much for having attended today's seminar. We had over 700 viewers and over 150 questions. So that was great. So keep an eye on your inboxes. We have a survey. So just tell us what you thought of today's talk, and there's a link that's going to pop up on your screen. So if you could fill that out, that would be great. Keep an eye on your inboxes because Professor Khan has compiled some further reading in case you're interested. So we'll be sending that as well as a link to the recorded seminar. Also, we have a new faculty member and a new topic of discussion every Wednesday and every Saturday at 8:30 p.m. So follow Ashoka University on Facebook and Twitter for more details. I hope to see you on Saturday at the next edition of Beyond the Classroom. Thank you so much for having joined us, and good night.